I am joined by my good friend, Elliot Abrams, who's had many roles in many administrations. I first met him when he was the Deputy National Security Advisor to President George Bush, George W. Bush. Obviously, he was doing things before that. But for this discussion, Elliot's currently at the Council on Foreign Relations, but he was the former U.S. envoy to Venezuela during the first Trump administration. And with all of these developments, I think that have been building over the last few weeks, this week, seems like it might be escalating. So we're really glad to have you, Elliot. And this is his first Substack Live.
It's true. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. I think a lot of people are wondering, this started with the administration going after boats that were they claim had drug smugglers. About 27 people were killed. We've never seen real solid evidence that they were drug traffickers, but the idea is that this was going after drug cartels, and President Bush kind of enacted some orders that authorized the U.S. military to do that.
President Trump.
Did I?
You said Bush. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, now we're back with President Trump. Sorry.
Right. I don't see any reason not to believe that those were drug smuggling vessels. I mean, they weren't pleasure boats. They had some kind of cargo. As you said, though, they were in international waters. The next step, which may come any day now, which the president is threatening to hit Venezuela, is a big step. I think he'll do it.
So let's back up a little. A couple of things. The administration has designated Trenta Agua as this Venezuelan gang and cartel as a terrorist organization. They've said that they're bringing fentanyl to the U.S. Venezuela isn't really a major source of fentanyl. It's Mexico. And the U.S. says most cocaine comes from Colombia. So is this being driven by drugs, or is it being driven by something else?
Well, certainly drugs is a big part of it. I mean, Venezuela under Maduro has been involved in drug trafficking year after year after year. Partly, this is Colombians who move across the border into Western Venezuela.
And we saw that some Colombians were killed the other day.
Yeah, and I mean, the Maduro regime is not trying really to drive them
Just
out.
stop them, right.
It's in business with them. I mean, bribes at the very least. If you're a Venezuelan general on the Colombian border, you've got a certain area of responsibility, it's understood that, this is how you make your living. You're going to take bribes from the drug traffickers. The ELN is also there, the Colombian guerrilla group. And it's true that many more drugs go through the Pacific side than the Atlantic side. But that's not to say that none go through the Atlantic side, the Caribbean. They do, and they come out of Venezuela. So I think this is clearly part of drug policy. It's also more than that. I mean, the president keeps talking about migration issues. That is, they emptied out their prisons of criminals, which I think is probably not true. And anyway, the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who are here in the United States are not criminals. They're people trying to make a living. No doubt there are some among them who are in prison, rightly in prison for crimes they committed, but the vast, 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 vast majority are not. I think there's another element here, and I can't prove it at all, but if I say that there's a kind of Monroe Doctrine element here, I don't think anybody would say that's crazy. I think that is the way the president thinks about this hemisphere. We should be the dominant element in this hemisphere. There are three viciously anti-American dictatorships in this hemisphere: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Cuba is supported by Venezuela. They give Cuba 30,000 to 50,000 barrels of oil a day free and have been for decades. If Venezuela had a democratic government, if Maduro were gone, that would stop, and the Cubans would be even more bankrupt than on the ropes, and that regime might fall. Maduro falls, Cuba falls, maybe Nicaragua, the last holdout, falls too. Um, President has 3 years. If at the end of those 3 years he can say, I have gotten rid of all the anti-American vicious regimes in this hemisphere. Now it's a hemisphere of peace and democracy. And we're going after all the drug traffickers with the help of these democratic governments. Um, that would be a great claim. That would be a great thing to do. And that is, I think, the kind of thing he likes to do. So I think there's, you can sort of single out the drug angle of this, the migration angle, but I think there is a larger picture here too.
So the drug isn't necessarily a fig leaf, so to speak, but there's a larger strategy there. Talk a little bit about Maduro. I think years ago when there was a lot of tension with Venezuela, everybody was more familiar with what he's done to the country. But just
Oh,
speak for a minute about Maduro himself and what he's done to Venezuela and why he's a threat to the
yeah.
U.S. and the region.
Well, let's go back far. When I was Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America in the Reagan administration, most of South America consisted of military dictatorships. The great exception was Venezuela. Venezuela was a democracy, and it was a rich democracy. And Chavez and Maduro, over the last 20 years, have destroyed the democracy and destroyed the economy. It's the largest refugee problem ever in the Western Hemisphere. And now, with people being able to return to Syria, I think it's fair to say, the largest refugee crisis in the world. About 20% of
Really?
all Venezuelans have had to leave their country and are now refugees from Venezuela. Um, they used to export 3 million barrels a day of oil, and that's now down. I mean, it goes back and forth, but maybe 800,000 barrels a day now. Um, so they've destroyed their own um, major asset, which is the oil industry. Um, Simultaneously, there's a kind of reign of terror there. We know that there was an election, and we know that Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition leader, won that election. There isn't a democracy in the world that claims that Maduro won that election. It's obvious he lost, and he lost big. He may have gotten 30% of the vote. So 70-30, that's a landslide. Um, he has driven Edmundo Gonzalez into exile. He's driven most of the opposition democratic leaders into exile. Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last week, is in hiding, lives in hiding. So it really is an awful situation. There are, at any given time, scores and scores of opposition political figures and human rights activists who are in prison, and in prison under awful conditions. So, from any point of view, social, economic, political, uh, Maduro is really turning what ought to be an ornament of Latin America and was a democracy into an impoverished, brutal uh, place where again, 20% of the population has already
Mm.
fled. It's a terrible story.
Now, when you were envoy, um, the approach
Uh,
was more explicit,
yeah.
like regime change. You recognized Juan Guaido. You attempted to, work on military defections. Why did that fail at the time, and what do you think is different now?
Mm. Um, why did it fail? Uh, I think one of the reasons it failed was we were going mostly by the old playbook um, of of that worked in Latin America in previous decades, which is you've got a, let's say, a military regime. Um, you negotiate with the generals, and after a while, you say you've got to go. You got to hold a free election. and they say we want amnesty for the coup, because that was the one thing they did that will send them to prison. And the Democratic opposition forces in every case. I mean, you can leave South America, Nelson Mandela in South Africa too. They all say yes, yes, we want to go back to democracy. Why didn't it happen in Venezuela? I think a big reason is that those military regimes, Brazil, Uruguay, um, they were not criminal gangs. This regime is. It is involved in human trafficking, gold trafficking, drug trafficking. And all the people at the top of the regime know that they could end up in prison for those activities. So it's much harder to get them to leave. Now, uh, my experience in the Trump first term was that the CIA didn't do anything. They didn't do anything.
And now you see President Trump the
Well,
other day authorize military action. You said you don't know if this is more psych ops here.
yeah. I mean, just turn for a minute to the military. We got, a flotilla. We've got 10,000 troops. That's enough to drive Maduro crazy. It's not enough to invade Venezuela. If you were going to invade the way we did Panama under George H.W. Bush, you would need many more than
Right.
10,000 troops. So what is it? And suppose the president, takes the next step and he bombs um, a couple of runways that are used for drug carrying planes and some ships in port, let's say, or a drug lab. Um, what's going on? What's the goal? I think the goal is to crack the regime. In that sense, it's a psyop. I think it first of all, and it's got several audiences. One of them is Maduro. Um, Another is the ring of people around him, basically saying, "You want to be Noriega? You want to be Bashar al-Assad? You better negotiate a deal now." You can keep widening the circle. The next circle would be the army, and I think, by the way, I was going to say covert action. This is a very interesting form
There's a
of
covert
covert.
finding, right?
There is we think, I mean, according to the New York Times, there's a finding. I don't know how covert it is when the president says, "Hey, I've got a covert finding." Um,
Exactly.
but that too,
We don't know
the
what's in it.
decision to be so public could be part of this kind of psyop to crack the regime. What,
Mhm.
but a covert finding doesn't mean that the president means to ask the CIA to be shooting anybody. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean they're going to use force. For example, he might say to the CIA, turn the army, get in touch with the colonels and tell them you're all going to go down with Maduro or get rid of him. Now, can the CIA do that? Are they capable of doing that? Do they have the right connections to do that? I think that remains to be seen. But I wouldn't underestimate here the the pressure on the regime if the United States and President Trump, newly dominant in the Middle East now, starts to say we're going to get rid of this guy. If you're a Venezuelan colonel, general,
Start running.
um, or you're a business person who's connected to the regime, I think you got to sit back and say, I don't know, is Maduro really going to make it? If Trump really wants to get rid of him, maybe I'd better start refiguring things. Maybe I'd better get out now. Maybe I'd better cooperate with the Americans. And I've had some evidence, secondhand, third hand, that people, I wouldn't say in the regime, connected to the regime, are doing that, are beginning to try to think of ways to be helpful to the United States so that if Maduro goes down, they don't go down with him.
Yeah, let's talk about what's going on in the administration itself. You have two camps. You have Rick Grinnell, who served as the director of national intelligence for a while, former ambassador to Germany. He's been
Yep.
around a while. And then you have Secretary of State. Rick has been trying to negotiate some mineral deals, some kind of more diplomatic solution. And then you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, I
Yep.
think has been long looking for some type of regime change there. Talk about how you see the different camps, and who is going to? It
Yeah.
looks like Rubio's on top here.
Yes. Pardon me. Early on, it looked like you had Grinnell on one side, and you had Rubio and the Florida delegation on the other.
Mm.
You had Senator Scott. You had all the members of Congress from certainly southern Florida, Democratic as well as Republican. Um, and it wasn't. There were moments where it looked like Grinnell was winning. He was
What was
down
he
there.
negotiating?
Well, he did negotiate the release of at least one hostage. Um, but I think it's clear that he was negotiating for an arrangement with Maduro, um, where, for example, um, Maduro would give certain mineral rights to the United States, um, would stop doing business with Iran or something like that. But it was with Maduro. And the idea was Maduro was going to stay in power. And obviously, the other camp was led by Rubio. Um, and it wasn't clear who was winning. For example, um, even today, Chevron is permitted to do business in Venezuela, which is kind of odd because we have these really strong sanctions on Venezuela. What is an American oil company doing there? That's part of the let's all get along side. Well, now, particularly in the last few weeks, there's pretty good evidence that Grinnell has been told, butt out. We're not negotiating with Maduro anymore. He's lost, and the business people again, who I think were in touch with Grinnell, are now realizing, well, that's not going to work. I'd add one other name in here, and that's Susie Wiles,
Hmm.
because
From
remember,
Florida.
exactly, exactly. I think there's a solid Florida front here.
Interesting. That Florida politics, where Rubio is from too.
Exactly.
So it's
Yep.
interesting because, you heard Maria Corina Machado and the
Yeah.
Venezuelan, they're clearly coordinating a little with the Trump administration.
Well,
If
sure.
not in action, then in messaging. And
Yeah.
it seems they've even developed plans if Maduro falls. Um, so do you think, when you were in the Bush administration, there was a lot of talk about how the US could work if Castro were to die and what would happen. So what would the US be doing here if Maduro does fall?
Um, let me just say first, um, this is a much better situation for the opposition and for the president, President Trump, than we were in 2019 with Juan Guaido, because we said, well, the presidency is vacant, see, because Maduro stole the election. And under their constitution, therefore, the Speaker of the National Assembly is the interim president. And that happened to be Juan Guaido. Um, this is a lot clearer case. They had an election. Maduro lost. Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate, won. And again, just about every democracy in the world, certainly Latin America, Europe, has said yes, Gonzalez won. So first, we know who the president of Venezuela is. That's resolved. What the United States would do, I think, is um, first, we would help them economically. They do have this asset of oil,
And
uh,
minerals,
and they have other minerals, right? And they have rare earth minerals, and they have
which
gold.
we could get.
So uh, that doesn't happen overnight, but you could start negotiating to
Exact,
help the
right.
Venezuelan economy. We can help them. We can say we can help you with the IMF. We can help you with the World Bank. We can help you with the Inter-American Development Bank to begin to get your economy on a decent footing again. We can help your military. One of the problems we had back in Trump 1 was we didn't know anybody in the Venezuelan military. We would take a look at, well, some of these guys went to the Army War College, right? Let's find out which Americans knew this Venezuelan who's now, a general. Seemed like a logical thing to do. Too much time had passed. People had retired.
Hmm.
There were no people actually in the service who had those connections that we have with just about every other Latin American military except Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela. But we can start to rebuild those. I mean, I think the message to the Venezuelan military would be, um, look, uh, Venezuela is a big country. You need a military. You need a modern military. We can help you supply modern equipment. You have a role in Venezuela's future. It's not drug trafficking. It's being a real military. Come on to the Army War College again and
Right.
join our exercises. Um, so we can help them a lot in a transition in a democracy. I mean, other Latin American countries can as well, but I think the United States is in a particularly good position to help with that transition. And again, we know what the top looks like. They have a president who they elected.
Yeah, and it also seems like when I said about the minerals, like that's another thing that's always seems to be in President Trump's mind, whether anywhere around the world about these mineral
Yeah.
deals. So if the U.S. were to help, I mean, but we've seen this, right? We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in Libya. Um, you know, mul- does you think like it could be stable and that the U.S. gets positioned in there to kind of help? Not just that it helps the US economically, but, help make sure there's not, paramilitary groups, narco traffickers, armed gangs with weapons kind of come in there and seize the country just like Maduro did.
Um, yeah, we would need to help them first in Western Venezuela against the Colombian gangs. Um, there are also criminal gangs all over the country
Would we
exploiting.
need to help with troops? I don't see that. You don't see that
I,
happening,
I
do you?
don't think the president would want to do that. Advisors, sure. I mean, that's no big deal. Um, Coast Guard people, Army Special Forces to help with training, replacing the Russians who are there now. There are a few hundred. The Cubans who are there now. Um, One of the interesting things about this is the Russians aren't owed money. They were owed billions of dollars, but they got it back in oil when they saw Venezuela's economy was falling, and so they owed something like $1 million, and they're going to want their money back. But again, they would have to cooperate with us if we were the dominant outside power in Venezuela, which I assume we would be. The Iran question is another interesting question.
Right.
And presumably, one of the things that would happen under a new Democratic government is it wants nothing to do with Iran and wouldn't be giving its its oil to Iran. One of the reasons they sell oil to Iran is their oil is sanctioned. So who's going to take it? Once the sanctions go, people can invest. There can be some redevelopment. I don't know how fast. I mean, if they're exporting 800,000 barrels a day, you could probably double that in 9 months, let's say. So you could do 1.5 million. And of course, that's revenue for the national government and for the Venezuelan economy. How much further you can go? Could you go to 2 million, 2.5 million? How long would it take? What's the market like? Their oil is very heavy, sour crude. Um, but this is not Haiti, let's say. It's not a country without natural resources. Venezuela has a lot of resources.
Okay, couple of last questions, and I want to end on a question on the Middle East because that's your day job right now. So Trump is conditioning a $20 billion bailout to Millei's party winning their elections.
Mm.
Kind of tying economic support to political outcomes. Should we be using this model in Venezuela? Do you see any connection in the region? Right now, it just definitely seems that President Trump has a
Yeah.
strategy for the region.
I think the Millet thing is different because that's a democracy. And so what you're saying there is you're saying to Argentine voters, you better vote this way, not that way. It's different in Venezuela. They have voted. They voted to get rid of Maduro. They voted for Edmundo Gonzalez. And all we are saying is they ought to get what they voted for.
Mhm. Um, do you see any connection between this whole immigration? There's a lot going on immigration, obviously, all these raids, but, the administration stripped TPS from 600,000 Venezuelans, using the threat from Venezuelan gangs operating in the country to justify going after these cities. I don't know if I'm like, connecting dots that aren't there, but I'm wondering if you see a connection because we keep hearing about Venezuelan gangs in the US.
Um, there is a migration connection, but I have to say I don't like it. I think the Venezuelans who are here came here for the same reason that they went to Chile or that they went to Colombia, to get away from a brutal dictatorship and to make a living in a country that um, was stable and prosperous, rather than trying the impossible in Venezuela. Um, so I'm not sympathetic to the idea that they emptied out the prisons and that all these Venezuelans are some kind of criminal. I think that is not true. What is true, though, is if Venezuela were on the road to recovery, we saw millions of Afghans go home. We saw millions, we are beginning to see hundreds of thousands of Syrians go home. I think you'd see substantial numbers of Venezuelans go home, maybe first from Latin America, but also from the US. So, from that point of view, yeah, the flow of refugees from Venezuela would stop if it could escape.
The administration designated Agua as a terrorist organization, claims Maduro controls it. And that's what, there's a lot of
Right,
justification for that in the
right,
country. But it
right.
seems that US intelligence agencies contradict that claim that this is coming,
Yeah,
that, yeah.
right. I'd rely more on the Cartel de los Soles, which has also been called a terrorist group. From the information I have, I'd be reluctant to say that Maduro is in charge of the Tren de Aragua. I'd be less hesitant to say that about the Cartel de los Soles.
Hmm.
The Soles, the suns, is a reference to the emblem on the Venezuelan army uniforms. Um, so I think there's a lot more evidence that that's kind of under the regime than there is for Tren de Aragua, which seems to me more like a sort of criminal cartel. I don't have the intel, but that's the way it looks to me.
So it seems, to put a finer point at it, it seems like, yes, drugs are coming from Venezuela, but there's a larger dissatisfaction with Maduro and Venezuela that seems to be headed towards some kind of efforts at regime change, whether it's military or trying
Right.
to encourage defections.
It, look,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
it looks that way. I mean, it's
Yeah.
hard to explain what's going on unless you have the ingredient of let's get rid of Maduro.
Mhm. Last question, because I have you, and it's been such a big couple of weeks in the Middle
Yeah.
East. I'm wondering what you think of this deal by President Trump. Um, obviously, it was a wonderful day that the hostages came home, and the fighting seems to have stopped for now. Um, what happens now? What are the missing
Yeah.
ingredients for this
Yeah.
to really take root? I think, peace in the Middle East is probably a little exaggerated, but clearly it's a better atmosphere. But looking ahead, what do you see as what we need to be keeping our eye on?
Well, the broader picture, I think, is a very good one, where people see that in the whole region, that the United States remains the dominant power, the most influence. Excuse me, China and Russia are nowhere. What did they do for their friends in Iran? Nothing, literally nothing. The narrower picture, what about Gaza? Um, I think it was very, very smart to create a phase one, phase two approach, where phase one is hostages go home, the prisoners, the some Palestinian prisoners are released, the fighting stops. But phase two is going to be really hard. I mean, the big question to me is who provides security in Gaza? We are today seeing in the half of Gaza that Israel has pulled back from, Hamas reasserting itself and shooting people in the street. Who's going to stop that? Under the Trump plan, there is an international security force and there are 10,000 Palestinian police. If you
In
go back
theory.
to, in theory, well, and the Palestinian police may exist, but there were that number of Palestinian police in Gaza in 2007, and Hamas got rid of them in about a week. So, and for the international forces, there isn't anybody. Now, that's got to be organized. People have to make pledges and fulfill their pledges. Are people actually going to start the reconstruction if Hamas is reasserting itself and shooting people in the streets? Maybe they'll start, maybe the reconstruction can start in the half of Gaza that's still under Israeli control. But I think it's critical to assemble that international security force if possible, or find out if it's impossible. Because otherwise, if it's not possible, then Hamas will take back that half. And you're back in a situation where Israel will be hitting them regularly. And what you will have done is, in a sense, save half of Gaza from Hamas. So I hope, I don't know, I hope that the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, working with some of the Arab governments, is assembling or trying to assemble that security force. I think that's the critical aspect here.
Because just to finish up, everyone said, yes, they did this horrible attack on Israel. I mean, the worst attack on the Jews since the Holocaust, but that the Palestinians are also victims of Hamas. Yes, they voted for Hamas, 20 years ago, but now they're suffering from Hamas still. So
yeah, they are suffering from Hamas. And I think it's very striking that all the demonstrators who, 2 weeks ago and two
right,
months ago were demonstrating against Israel ought
are
to be
not
out in the
demonstrating.
streets now demonstrating on behalf of the, theoretically, they're doing this for the Palestinians. Palestinians in Gaza are being shot in the street because they oppose Hamas. No demonstrations. I mean, it's disgusting, but it's not very surprising. But again, I think in a way, the reconstruction part of this is the easy part. Getting
The
donations,
governance.
absolutely. The administrative governance, it's the security that's the hard part.
Yeah, and I remember you were so involved in that during the on reform issues and the Palestinian territories during the Bush administration.
Right.
Elliot, your first Substack Live, you came out of the park on fire. Thank you so much. I feel so much
Yeah,
more knowledgeable about what's going on in Venezuela, and would love to have you back on this in the
great.
Middle East. And thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Bye bye.
Thanks, everybody. We'll put this recording on with show notes, and thanks, everybody, for joining. Take care. Bye-bye.